Hi, this is Jim. The first video I did on this subject generated some really interesting comments. A number of people pointed me to some work that Brian Litz has done in taking high-speed videos of the bullet as it exits the muzzle of a 22. And here's a picture of one of those. I'll show you a little close-up of the bullet. And at first glance, it looks like, okay, that's what I'd expect. I mean, it looks like probably an SK or Lapua or some other similar bullet. But then you start to think about it and you say, now, wait a second, where's the heel? You remember that for 22s, because the bullet has to go into a casing, which is the same diameter as the outside of the bullet, there has to be a part in the back that's smaller diameter called the heel. But you look at this picture and the heel's gone. Apparently the $12 word for this is obturated, which means that the lead has expanded to meet the diameter of the barrel. Anyway, that's pretty interesting. If you actually look at the back of most 22s, every one I've taken apart, there's a cupped out shape to the heel, which sort of suggests to me that the designers of the bullet intended that heel to be flattened up against the back of the bullet. I'm not sure that's true, but it sort of looks that way. So anyway, I went back to work and took some of my models and just squished the heel or obturated the heel to see what kind of difference that makes to at least the modeled performance of the bullet. Now, there's two things going on there. One is you're losing the small aerodynamic benefit of having, it's a bit of streamlining by having a heel back there. But on the other hand, you're actually shortening the bullet, so there's less surface area. So you have these two counterbalancing forces. And when I run the simulations, the simulation suggests that there's a slight drag penalty for having the heel gone. But it's certainly within the accuracy of these models and not that significant. Since I was on this path, I went ahead and took some other bullets, common bullets, and squished the heel or obturated the heel and simulated them. The next one is SK or Lapua shape. It's very, very close to the Ely bullet, possibly a little bit better in the supersonic regime, but we almost all shoot subsonic bullets, so it doesn't really matter. But they're essentially identical otherwise. Another one, common bullet, used more in hunting small game, is hollow point bullet, which has quite a different shape. But, it's really not that different from the point of view of the drag. Possibly a little bit higher drag at low velocities and possibly a bit better at supersonic speeds. And if any bullet was going to be shot supersonic, that would probably be a hunting round, so that makes sense. So going back to the conclusions of the previous video, if you've got a ballistic calculator that has the RA4 model available, I would certainly use that. It pretty much lines right up on top of this, any of these bullets I simulated, at least in the region we're interested in. And you see that little kink in the Ely curve. I didn't run every last little, velocity to smooth out that curve because these runs take most of a day, each run. But if I were to do that, I think you'd see that Ely curve smoothed out and ended up falling pretty much right on top of RA4. Now I'm using a Kestrel and it doesn't have that model, but it does have the G7. And just like before, if you imagine moving the G7 curve upwards, at least in the region of interest, it'd be a really good fit with Ely. And that's what I see when I plug in the G7 model into my Kestrel with the measured muzzle velocity from a chronograph. I get a really good fit. Now, I only shoot out to 200. I don't have easy access to longer range. So some of you who've got 300 and 400 ranges might have some more information there as to how well the model works. But This is all I've got right now. Once again, the model which doesn't work is the G1 model, which is unfortunately the one that the ammo manufacturers are always referencing when they're bragging about their drag curve. But, you know, that bragging aside, if you just want to calculate your dope at every distance, don't use the G1. So just summarizing, here's what I'm using. Be interested in what other people are doing. I'm using my Kestrel ballistic calculator. I'm using the G7 model. I recommend taking a lot of shots to get your average velocity. What I do is I just leave my chronograph on in a match, like at bench rest. And so I'll get over 100 results that way, and I get a pretty good average of what the muzzle velocity is. And of course, when I just got a new gun and when the barrel was new, I was getting lower values, but now that the barrel's had a few thousand rounds through it, I'm getting pretty consistent values now. The G7 ballistic coefficient, which I just looked up online, I'm using is 0.069. And of course, I zero my scope for a 22 at 50 yards, which works out pretty well. So some other interesting feedback. Now this is getting away from practical stuff, just sort of interesting stuff. So where does this G1 model come from? And I was thinking, well, it's got to be before World War II because, you know, it doesn't seem to know about shockwaves and stuff like that. But some people said it's probably before World War I. There was a big arms race. The super weapon of the 1900s was the howitzer and the battleship. And there was a huge arms race back then, and Krupp Steel and other companies were selling a lot of guns all around the world. And so, you know, several people suggested that that's where this comes from. So imagine that's before any kind of real electronics. It's amazing they came up with a drag curve at all. Now, I put a little time into trying to find shapes that would actually have a drag curve like the G1. And I did find a couple. One of them is just a ball, a sphere, or think of it as a musket ball. And the other one is just a cylinder, which you can think of as a flat-nosed slug. And those are both really poorly streamlined. So much so that the air has to be deflected so quickly that it starts generating shock waves at lower velocities than a more modern shape would. And so this results in the drag kicking in earlier than you'd see shooting a modern bullet. And so if you look at the drag curves, they're certainly not a perfect match, but the ball and the cylinder are starting to look a lot more like the G1. But interestingly enough, if you take the front half of a ball and you put it on a cylinder and make a bullet out of that, it starts looking a lot like some of the shells that were shot in World War I, like the British 8-pounder kind of shell. And so I made a 22 just based on that. And you know, it's not that bad a bullet. And it certainly doesn't follow the G1 drag curve. So once again, I'm sort of nonplussed as to how the G1 came about, but it doesn't really matter. Just don't use it. So here's a little comparison of that round nose bullet versus Ely, and you can see it's pretty primitive, but it doesn't do badly at all. So this got me along the track of thinking about sort of the range of bullets that a bullet designer might consider. Another one which I've shown before, but I've taken the heel off this time, is a theoretical streamlined 22. And so I've got a longer nose on it, and so I can get a nice streamlined shape. And that is substantially different than any of the current 22s. It has a much lower drag. So I've mentioned all these different bullets. Let's sort of rack them up in terms of how they might perform in different ways you can evaluate a bullet. And the first thing I did was to look at how much angular momentum the bullet generates as it's spinning through the air. And presumably the more angular momentum you have, the more stable it is due to centrifugal force. And the shape which has the highest angular momentum is the cylinder, because it's got, at least for solid objects, it's got the most mass at the full radius. And the ball is, of course, the worst. But if you actually look at the rest of the bullets, they're really not that different. There isn't a large, or really probably a significant change in angular momentum based on the shape, although that theoretical streamlined bullet would be sort of low. It's not significantly low. So I concluded that isn't a driving force in how bullets are picked. Another thing I looked at was how much force, aerodynamic force, is generated if the bullet isn't flying through the air straight. This is most likely due to a crosswind, but it could also be that the bullet ends up canted, leaving the muzzle. And so this is ignoring spin effects, just aerodynamically, how much basically lift is generated when the bullet is canted, and that is a force that would drive the bullet away from your objective. Now, in this case, the ball is like the perfect shape, because it doesn't matter how you orient a sphere, it always looks the same. So that's the one thing it has going for it. But again, there's really not that much difference between these different shapes. Possibly Ely has an advantage there with that patented flat nose. It seemed to generate a little less lift. I was surprised. I was thinking the streamlined shape would be bad in terms of being deflected, but that's not the case. And of course, why did I think that? Because there are all these, centerfire rounds which have streamlined shapes, and they fly just great. So I was just wrong about that. So again, I don't see that aerodynamic force as being a strong driver in the selection of bullets. And then finally, of course, is drag, where all the modern bullets look about the same, but this streamlined shape is substantially better. And so, why don't we have the streamlined bullets? And I think the answer is simple. It's they won't fit in the mag. They won't feed. If you're a bullet manufacturer, there's this enormous market for bullets that will fit, standard 22 magazines and chambers, etc. So there's really no economic driving force for them to develop, more streamlined bullets. Now, I don't have access to a long range, but if I were, and I know some number of you are, and maybe you've already done this, I would certainly be tempted to take existing bullets, shave off the front, and attach a streamlined point to it and just see what happens. It would have to be very, very smooth, because you don't want any little ripples in there are going to generate shock waves, and that's certainly not going to help. So, just naively using a primitive 3D printing device that gives rough edges is probably not good enough. But if you have some way to generate a plastic streamlined nose, I'd be real interested. You'd have to single feed it, and so you're not going to use Rimex to do that, but most guns you can just feed a single shot. So anyway, if you've done that or are planning to do it, I'd sure be interested in what happened and how big the groups are. Is there some factor I'm not seeing here that would stop a streamlined 22 from working? Okay, that's all I've got for you, and thanks again for everybody that took the time to comment. Sort of interesting conversation about my favorite subject, 22s. Have fun at the range.